What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. We head into week 2 of fantasy football. Thank God, because week 1 was a little bit rough, right? A lot of people are flipping the hell out right now, and y'all just need to calm down. You need to relax a little bit. It's been 1 week. We have people in the comment section asking if they should drop their second, third, or fourth round picks for guys off of waivers after 1 week. Do not do that. I made specific videos about this in the offseason, telling people not to panic, don't freak out early. It's one of the biggest mistakes you can make in fantasy football, so you gotta calm down and let things play out. Remember, a lot of these players didn't even play in the preseason because they didn't want them to be injured before the season started. There's some rust that's going to be there. That's expected. That's okay. That's going to happen. So what we're going to do here, we're going to head in to all the matchups, give you all the information you need to make the best decisions for your teams here this week. And we're going to kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We're talking about the Los Angeles Chargers and the Kansas City Chiefs. And Austin Ekeler is one of those guys that a lot of people are worried about, right? Last week ended with only 72 total yards, wasn't able to find the end zone, only scored 9.2 fantasy points against the Raiders. Now, he dominated carries in that backfield. He got 14 of them and tied for the team league in targets with 4. So you know the volume is still going to be there. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City could be high-powered, back and forth. They just allowed over 21 fantasy points to running backs last week. And we know that Keenan Allen, not good, right? So we're going to be looking for some playmakers here in this offense while Keenan Allen rests up, and that screams Austin Ekeler. The touchdowns are coming. There's not an overly large split in this backfield that I'm too concerned about. So Austin Ekeler, even though he had a down week 1, I'm looking for the bounce back this week. Thursday Night Football, 19 out of 25 points going to be a start. For Kansas City, we got 3 guys who all got touches. Now CEH is good. He's not good. He's good. He's not good. He's good. What is he? Right now, I'm guessing he's pretty good. I mean, he had himself a solid day, didn't really have to do a whole lot in that offense, though. Kansas City got out to a lead so quick, they didn't have to rely on the pass-catching running back of CEH very much, right? They didn't need him much in the second half, but what they did do is they utilized Isaiah Pacheco in the second half, in garbage time, I guess you could say, and the kid is pretty good. Now, does what he did in garbage time warrant him maybe more touches earlier in the game? That is entirely a possibility, especially in a closer ball game. If that's the case, we could see a little bit less volume going the way of CEH, but we don't know that for sure yet. Like I said, the huge second half lead really just, led them to say, hey, let's give the kid a chance, and he looked pretty good. Now a matchup going up against the Chargers is going to be much more difficult than last week's matchup against Arizona. The Chargers allowed 17.6 fantasy points per game in week 1. No main injuries to worry about here in Kansas City. When it comes to the X factor, I'm just a little bit worried that Pacheco starts to eat into CEH's early down work a little bit as the season progresses. Now, the pass-catching upside should still be there for CEH, and if the big plays continue, we're not going to care about the slight, bump down in volume, but it's something to pay attention to. Their X factors are a lot closer across the board here in Kansas City. CEH still scored 16 out of 25 points and is going to be a start. Now we're going to go down to Miami and Baltimore Sunday football here, and Chase Edmonds is another one of those guys that if you watch the game on Sunday, it felt like you saw Chase Edmonds a lot. It felt like he was constantly involved in the offense. And then you looked at the box score afterwards, it was like, dude only had 29 yards and no touchdowns. That was not great. It seemed like as you were watching the game, if you weren't following the box scores along, it seemed like he was doing better than what he was doing. What was great to see was the touches. He had 16 total touches. The next closest to him in that backfield was Raheem Mostert, and he only had 6 touches. And he didn't do any better than Chase Edmonds, so it's not like he's going to eat into his work. Now, a matchup going up against Baltimore, they allowed 20.6 fantasy points to opposing running backs in week 1. No major injuries in Miami to worry about, but when it comes to X Factor, it's all about the commitment. And right now, they seem to be committed to Chase Edmonds getting the volume in this offense, which is great. One thing to consider also, Baltimore just allowed 13 receptions to the running backs of the Jets last week. That just screams potential for Chase Edmonds. He scored 16 out of 25 and is going to be a start. For the Ravens, I don't think I want a whole lot to do with this backfield, if I'm being completely honest. It's an absolute mess until J.K. Dobbins comes back and is 100% healthy. Does Dobbins even play this week? We do not know for sure. Drake only managed 46 total yards and 2.8 yards per carry. That's not what we want in our fantasy lineups. Now, he was the clear option in the backfield just last week. He outtouched the next closest running back 12-4 in a matchup this week going up against Miami, who allowed 19.3 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But the problem here is injuries, not just to J.K. Dobbins, which we still don't know. Left tackle Ronnie Stanley, does he play? They just lost another offensive tackle, Juwan James, last week. That is a huge, huge loss to this offensive line. And it worries me even more so when J.K. Dobbins does return. Is he going to have running lanes to go through? They're going to have to rely on the short passing game with their running backs, and that worries me. Now going up against a solid defense in Miami that really contained the running backs of New England in week 1, if you saw that game, I'm not overly excited here. And until we get more clarity in this backfield and more production, they're all going to be sits for me in Baltimore. But now we'll head out to Cleveland for the Jets and the Browns. And for the Jets, you got Breece Hall, you got Michael Carter. It was great to see Michael Carter end the game with 100 total yards. Only 61 total yards for Breece Hall, but there wasn't any touchdowns to go around. And this offense is going to remain limited, I guess you could say, when it comes to scoring opportunities with Joe Flacco under center. Not taking a whole lot away from Joe Flacco, but he's not really going to lead a high-powered offense to tons of scoring opportunities. And we kind of saw that just last week. Now, what I wasn't expecting was the role reversal. We had Michael Carter out-carry Breece Hall on the ground, and Breece Hall out-target Michael Carter in the passing game. 10 targets for Breece Hall is a great number to see. When it comes to overall touches, Carter did have the lead, 17-12, though not a huge surprise. We know they like Michael Carter. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland. Last week, they allowed 14.5 fantasy points per game to the Carolina Panthers. No major injury concerns with these two. They're both going to get pass-catching opportunities, which is great to see because that really helps raise the floor up every single week. But it's going to come down to, can they score a touchdown? And it's not going to happen every single week, especially not for both of them. And it's going to make this backfield super hard to nail weekly. For right now, if I'm looking at an option in this backfield, it's going to be Michael Carter since he's getting that work on the ground as well, plus the passing work. So right now, it's not a locked in stone great start. He only scored 16 out of 25 possible points. Barely a start, but I'm edging Michael Carter over Breece Hall for right now. For the Cleveland Browns side of things, 35.8 fantasy points were scored combined by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. Chubb with 141 rushing yards, Hunt with the 2 touchdowns. Now, Chubb out-touched Kareem Hunt here this past week, 23-15. Both of these guys are going to continue to get huge touches. Do not expect Jacoby Brissett to go out and throw for over 35 pass attempts per game. They're going to be a run-first offense. Now they get a matchup going up against the Jets, who allow 8.3 fantasy points per game. But that was against Baltimore last week, and we know that that backfield is a mess, so I'm not calling the Jets defense some absolute juggernaut when it comes to run defense. I expect that number to creep up, especially after this week. When it comes to injuries, does Cleveland get back offensive tackle Jack Conklin? He was super close to playing last week, and if he can come back this week, that's only going to make that offensive line better. That is a huge piece to the offensive line. This is going to be a run-first team, and these two guys are going to get volume, and volume. Last thing I'm going to say about that is note to self out there. You should not be disappointed in Nick Chubb's performance when he rushed for 141 yards on the ground. I saw people out there this weekend complaining that Kareem Hunt had the touchdowns. Watch the game. See what happened. Why did Hunt have those touchdowns? Does it overly matter? We've told people to grab these guys by the bunches this offseason because we expected things like this to happen with no Deshaun Watson. A huge backfield, probably one of the best backfields in all of fantasy football to own. Both of these guys going to remain starts weekly and be a solid piece to your fantasy squad each and every week. Now, how about we go down to Washington and Detroit? Started off with Washington and Antonio Gibson. Last week had 130 total yards for Antonio Gibson, including a sweet 7 receptions for 72 yards. Hallelujah. Ron Rivera is utilizing one Antonio Gibson in the passing game even deeper down the field, which is great to see. When it comes to volume, J.D. McKissic wasn't overly involved. Gibson outtouched him 21-11. He's the clear number 1 in this backfield for right now and the foreseeable future until we get Brian Robinson back. When it comes to matchup, going up against the Detroit Lions, who just allowed 34.7 fantasy points to the running backs of the Philadelphia Eagles just last week. All 3 Philly running backs scored a touchdown. Great matchup this week for Antonio Gibson. No major injuries for him to worry about. And the X factor is this: the pass catching work. We have been screaming for years that we need Antonio Gibson more involved in the passing game. 7 receptions in week 1. If we can get anything close to that, maybe we don't talk about Brian Robinson when he comes back, because Antonio Gibson will have performed way above and beyond their expectations, and he's the guy rest of season. Really, really want to pay attention to this backfield as we get closer to that return, because if Gibson keeps producing, that X Factor number is going to shoot up because we love the pass catching work. It really makes him a safer weekly option. He's going to be a start this week. For Detroit, shouldn't be much of a surprise here either. DeAndre Swift went out there and went absolutely bananas and could have actually had a bigger day than what we saw. Now, when you see DeAndre Swift, the biggest issue we've had with him over the years is that Dan Campbell wouldn't really overly commit to him. Maybe he'd get all the garbage time when they're playing from behind in the end. Not the case, right? We just saw DeAndre Swift go out and get 175 total yards, a touchdown, and a top 5 finish. He out-touched Jamal Williams 18-13, and Swift was way, way more effective on the ground. 9.6 yards per carry. That is crazy. Now, yes, Jamal Williams on the goal line, that could suck at times this year because he could take some of those touchdowns away from DeAndre Swift, and that's going to irritate some of his owners. But with that type of numbers, with that type of efficiency, I don't think it really matters. Last week, Washington allowed almost 27 fantasy points in week 1 to opposing running backs. No major injury concerns here. The offensive line played really well there in Detroit. And it's going to open up huge holes for DeAndre Swift. And we know that this guy is a big-time playmaker. When Swift gets touches, he wins you matchups. We've said that for years. He seems to be getting the touches. He's going to win you some matchups and going to be a start for us here this week again. Now down to Jacksonville. We have the Indianapolis Colts and Jacksonville Jaguars. Shouldn't be thinking too much about this one when it comes to the Indianapolis Colts. I think that we all know that you should probably start Jonathan Taylor because he kind of does Jonathan Taylor type of things. 175 total yards and a touchdown week 1 against the Houston Texans. Now Hines, he managed 8.4 fantasy points this past week in a game in which he really wasn't overly utilized. 35 touches for Jonathan Taylor in week 1. Probably wasn't expecting that high of a number, especially with the reports this offseason that they were going to take back some of his touches, right? Yeah, that's really going to happen. No, they're still going to utilize JT when they need to. He's still going to be a 20-plus touch a week guy. Game script here was not what they had really hoped for, right? I think when they came into that game last week that they were really expecting to kind of steamroll the Houston Texans. That didn't really happen. Caught them off guard, forced them to change their game plan and go to the guy that leads them to the promised land in Jonathan Taylor. Came up just short, right? Absolutely. Now the Jacksonville Jaguars last week, they gave up 22.8 fantasy points to opposing running backs, and volume is king here when it comes to Jonathan Taylor. I'm not going to tell you too much more. You already know you should be starting him. For the Jacksonville Jaguar side of things, though, maybe this catches a few people by surprise. I have James Robinson as a sit, Travis Etienne as a start, but James Robinson, I'm talking 1 point away from being a start. Maybe he just said, hey, pissed on that Achilles injury, I'm good to go. I don't need the damn thing anyway. But 69 total yards for Etienne wasn't bad either, and he averaged 11.8 yards per carry and dropped a touchdown on the goal line. The numbers for Etienne could have been great if it wasn't for that one bad drop. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, yeah, he sucks because he dropped it. Don't forget, even though that guy isn't a rookie anymore, that was his first ever NFL career game. I'm sure there were some butterflies going through, and I seriously expect him to improve on those things going forward. Now, neither one of these guys saw huge volume. J-Rob out-touched Etienne 12-6. Not overly, excited about the amount of volume back there. And now they get a matchup going up against the Indianapolis Colts, who only allowed 13.9 fantasy points to future Hall of Fame running back Dameon Pierce, everybody's, Twitter love child for fantasy football this past week, and Rex Burkhead. So we know this is going to be a solid defense. Does the continued volume to James Robinson wear him down at some point? I don't know. I don't think that they give him enough volume to get to that point, but we really haven't seen this guy with a heavy workload. And if we start to get more touches, do we see the efficiencies coming down? Does he become more touchdown dependent? Both of these guys are going to get those touchdown opportunities. Jacksonville is able to move the ball a little bit better this year than what we saw last year. How long does it take Travis Etienne to really get into game speed, right? How long does it really take him to come up to speed in this offense and be like, I am ready to go? Don't forget, like I said, it was his first ever NFL game. I'm not writing him off whatsoever. He's going to be a borderline. I'm talking just much of a start for me, scoring 15 out of 25 points, just barely crossing over into the start category. How about New Orleans and Tampa Bay next? Now, We're going to talk about Leonard Fournette first, who I guess is calling himself, what now, Sunday Night Lenny, whatever it may be. Leonard Fournette looked pretty good. 137 total yards, 14.7 fantasy points, going up against the Dallas defense in week 1. Had 23 total touches, but really saw a lot less passing work than I had kind of expected. He was running the ball on the ground so well, they just continued to utilize him that way because it was working for Tampa Bay. Now a matchup going up against the Saints. They allowed 21.8 fantasy points to running backs last week. A lot of that to Cordarrelle Patterson. Now this offensive line, though, is becoming a problem in Tampa Bay. On top of all the other injuries they've had over the weeks, now they've lost offensive tackle Donovan Smith, which is a huge loss. He's been one of the best offensive linemen there for Tom Brady for quite some time, and that's going to hurt the running game. So maybe we start to see a little bit more in that passing game going forward if they can't find the running lanes to run through on the ground. When it comes to the X factor, it is that passing game. We know that Tom Brady is going to check down. He's checked down to running backs his entire career. It's going to happen. And plus, when you look at all that rushing work on the ground, Leonard Fournette had 21 carries last week. That's the second highest total he's ever had in Tampa Bay. I don't expect that type of volume every single week on the ground. 20 plus touches combined through the air and the ground. That is what I expect, and I expect more passing work here this week. He's going to be a start. As for Alvin Kamara, I am worried a little bit about Alvin Kamara this week. This is going to be a risky start for you. Now, I've said all offseason that something had to give in this New Orleans offense. There's a lot more weapons here than we've had in the past. 6.1 fantasy points for Kamara against the Atlanta Falcons. That hurt a lot of people. That is not ideal, but the volume wasn't really there either. They're throwing the ball down the field more. They're not overly reliant on just Alvin Kamara. He only had 12 total touches, only 4 targets, was actually 4th on the team in targets. Now a matchup against Tampa Bay. They just allowed 8.6 fantasy points in week 1 to the Dallas Cowboys and Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott. Reports are starting to come out that Alvin Kamara was dealing with a rib injury. Doesn't seem to be able to limit him, and he should be able to play through it. But how does that limit his ability to break tackles and get that extra yardage? Something that's going to have to be paid attention to. X factor wise, it's Alvin Kamara. He's still somebody who can find the end zone in a moment's notice. I don't think that the Saints are going to look at him and be like, we don't need him. Big days are coming. This is a very, very risky matchup for him. He is a borderline start for me, scoring only 15 out of 25 fantasy points, and I am concerned about starting him here this week. But if you drafted Alvin Kamara, with all the things going on in the NFL, can you really afford to sit him? No, probably not. You just have to suck up this tough matchup and move on. How about we go up to New York now for the New York Giants and Carolina Panthers, which is going to be my Manscaped matchup of the week. Don't forget, as soon as this video is over, head over to manscaped.com. Get yourself something nice for the travel bag. It's not just ball trimmers. They got you covered for anything you need in the bathroom, fellas. Use promo code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. First up, CMC. Is this what CMC looks like on a pitch count? Because it kind of looked like it. Only 57 total yards, but he did have a touchdown and 13.7 fantasy points. So he didn't kill you this past week. Of course, you expected more, but only had 14 total touches. That's just a crazy number to see for Christian McCaffrey. We're used to seeing 20 plus each and every week, but that was a very tough defense for him to go up against in the Cleveland Browns last week. Now, going up against the Giants, who allowed 28.6 fantasy points to running backs last week, is going to give him the opportunity maybe for a little bit more volume. He escaped healthy as of now, which is great. Maybe this is going to help him stay healthier all year long, not overworking him so much earlier on in the season. X factor, though, this guy has 30 plus touch potential each and every week. Does he see that number consistently? No, probably not, but he's not splitting touches with anyone, and he's going to have to be relied upon in this offense if they want to continue to find the end zone. Maybe we see less touches. Maybe we see less yardage, but maybe we start to see more touchdowns going forward, and that's still going to help you from a fantasy perspective. CMC is still going to be a start. For Saquon Barkley, wow, Finally, he's back. We've been waiting to see this for over 2 years now, and it's finally happened for Saquon Barkley. That was our biggest concern in the offseason, right? We were telling people, hey, this dude is a great value in drafts. But we are somewhat concerned, like, what's he going to look like? He hasn't looked explosive as of late. He hasn't had those big lanes to run through. He hasn't had the big rushes, the big breakaway runs. We haven't seen that. Daniel Jones hasn't been able to put the ball down the field enough to draw defenders outside of the box. And Saquon Barkley came out and just said, piss on it, I'm going nuclear. 194 total yards, 30.4 fantasy points, 24 total touches was the most we've seen from him in a long, long time. So you know they aren't throttling him back at all. Now a matchup against Carolina, who just got smoked on the ground by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb, giving up over 35 fantasy points to them in that game. No major health concerns as of right now, but it is the burst that gave me the 5 for the X Factor. We saw the big playability for the first time in years from Saquon Barkley. That's what elevated him to the status that so many people put him at the top years ago. It was the home run upside, and we're starting to see that return, and it's a great thing for Saquon Barkley. He put it on display in week 1 and is going to have a chance to do it once again here in week 2. And actually, I'm going to head over to Prize Picks right now and smash the over on Saquon Barkley. Right now, currently set at 70.5 rushing yards. We saw that Carolina defense absolutely annihilated by the Cleveland Browns. Saquon Barkley looking pretty good. Give me the over there on Prize Picks. Pittsburgh and New England next. Now, started off with the New England Patriots, kind of a disappointment last week for Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson. Both these guys basically held in check last week. 6.8 fantasy points for Harris, 3.7 for Stevenson, and they just could not get anything going. Now, Miami was able to get a lead in that game against the New England Patriots, and that really led to a lot of this kind of having to be scaled back from a running standpoint. The touches, though, they were almost 50-50. 11 touches for Harris, 10 for Ramondre Stevenson. Now a matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who allowed 23 fantasy points last week to running backs, and now no TJ Watt either. When it comes to injuries, Mac Jones was dealing with some back spasms. Do we see them rely a little bit more heavily on the running game to take some of that pressure off of Mac Jones this week until he can get back to full health? That's how I kind of see this game going. More reliancy on the running backs. If Mac Jones isn't 100% and the Pittsburgh Steelers don't have TJ Watt, all of a sudden these guys become a little bit closer to a start. They are borderline starts. 15 out of 25 points, 1 point less for either one of these guys, and they're going to be a sit. So they're not some smash start of the week, but as flex plays this week, I don't mind it whatsoever. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, okay, I got to put up extra font or something here. Huge risk. I'm talking about huge risk, and you have to pay attention to this. Listen to what I'm saying. Don't just look at the graphic and scroll by and leave a comment, I can't believe you have a sit for Najee Harris. I am worried about Najee Harris this week. I've talked to the doc. He is worried about Najee Harris. We were already concerned that he had some rust from not really playing in the preseason. Then he left last week with that lower leg injury, and at one point was expected to miss some time. Now, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, but even prior to the injury, he only averaged 2.3 yards per carry. Only had 12 touches prior to the injury. So obviously, if he's healthy, that number's going to be higher, but how healthy is he? And now he gets a matchup going up against the New England Patriots, one of the better run defenses in the NFL. They just allowed 13.7 fantasy points last week to opposing running backs, which is great. We had a sprained Lisfranc in the offseason for Najee Harris that kept him from really participating much this preseason. And now we injure the same foot in week 1. I'm concerned about Najee Harris. I mean, I just don't see the Steelers going out there and risking it and giving this guy huge volume. I see limited touches if he plays. I see inefficient touches. He was inefficient last year. Don't forget that. He is not some guy that averages 5 yards per carry. He's like a 4 yard per carry guy when he's 100% healthy, maybe 4.3. Injured, 2.3 yards per carry last week. I'm just concerned. I think that we start to see maybe a little bit more Jaylen Warren sprinkled in. I think we see some Chase Claypool taking carries out of the backfield once again. Listen, you may not have better options. Maybe you just say, hey, you know what? I want to take that risk. But as of right now, with all the information provided on Najee, I don't know if I want to risk it or not. Make sure that you follow our videos throughout the week, especially the Saturday night live stream and the Sunday morning live stream, when we'll have an entire week's worth of data that we can then present to you and say, hey, this is how we feel about Najee at that time. But given right now, I'm worried that we don't get too much Najee if he even plays here this week. Now, how about the Atlanta Falcons, Los Angeles Rams? We have Cordero Patterson for the Atlanta Falcons. And really, the early game injury to Damian Williams opened the door to added touches for Cordarrelle Patterson. He had 136 total yards, 5.5 yards per carry, and 21.1 fantasy points. Also had 25 total touches. His high at any time last year was 21. He only broke 20 total touches once in 2021 last year, which was a great year for him. They don't want to utilize him 25 times a game because he will break down over the course of a season. They kind of had to do that last week with the injury to Damian Williams. Now, I'm not saying that they don't want to play Cordarrelle Patterson. Of course they do, but they want him for all 17 games. The guy's kind of an X factor himself. It's hard for defenses to really account for Cordarrelle Patterson and how versatile he is in an offense. Now, the Rams, difficult matchup. They allowed only 10 fantasy points last week to running backs. Damian Williams' availability. Do we see some Tyler Algier this week in this backfield if he's unable to go? There could be an opportunity where maybe Cordarrelle Patterson is scaled back to 18, 19 touches, which is still not bad. With the efficiency that we've seen from him involved on the ground and through the air, it's the versatility that really makes him a start once again this week, even though it is a tough matchup going up against the Rams, scoring 20 out of 25 points and is a start for me here this week. For the Rams, listen, a lot of people were upset about Cam Akers last week. I said in the start-sit video for Cam Akers last week that, listen, he is a borderline start because you spent a 4th-round pick on the guy. You didn't listen to us all offseason when we told you to avoid him on the audio podcast, in YouTube videos, in our draft guide. You still drafted him. At that point, you're kind of pot committed. You had to start him week 1. And then he totally burned you. Now, Darrell Henderson, a lot of people want to say, oh man, I'm so glad I picked up Henderson late. Guy is an absolute stud. Slow down just a little bit. I mean, he wasn't an overall stud, right? I mean, he still didn't have a huge game. 9.8 fantasy points isn't absolutely astronomical nowadays. But what's weird about this is I sure haven't seen a whole lot of people on Twitter or YouTube owning up to Cam Akers being an early season mistake. It's kind of funny how that works out. But now, going back to this matchup with Henderson, out-touching Cam Akers last week 18-3. Akers had some very bad pass protection at some points in that game. He kind of looked lost at times. Is Cam Akers still a little bit hesitant about the Achilles? Is he not back 100% mentally to the point to where he trusts it enough to fully push off of that foot? Just something to pay attention to. He needs to build that confidence. I'm going to say this. Cam Akers is going to get work at some point. Cam Akers at some point is going to produce in this backfield. That could happen at any time. I will take my chances with him being on my bench and me missing on that big game until I see it happen. I do not want to continually throw him out there and risk starting him for him to come out and get 3 touches. When he has that good game, when he has that breakout game of 2022, then from that point on, I will consider him as a start weekly. But until we see that, not interested. Darrell Henderson going to be the guy in this backfield as of right now. He's a fringe start for me in a difficult matchup, scoring 15 out of 25 points, but he is the guy to own and start in this backfield at this point in time. He's another one of those guys that can't stay overly healthy for the entire span of a season either, so don't get overly excited. He may end up being one of these guys that if we can get him to produce some decent numbers for the next week or two, could be a sell high candidate to where you could absolutely return a king's ransom at some point here in this fantasy season. So make sure you pay attention to that. Now we go out to the NFC West, the San Francisco 49ers and Seattle Seahawks. Now Rashad Penny only managed 60 yards, but that was against a difficult Denver front this past week, but he averaged 5 yards per carry, had 14 total touches in a tight game. And honestly, Geno Smith was playing pretty freaking well. San Francisco allowed 17.3 fantasy points to running backs last week. No major injury concerns as of yet for Rashad Penny, but this guy just continues to find ways to break through running lanes that don't exist. He is a very solid running back. The biggest knock on Rashad Penny throughout his career has been health. If he's healthy, he's going to do pretty well with the touches he is given. He needs a little bit more volume. We could see that this week, and Rashad Penny going to be a fringe start for me once again, scoring 16 out of 25 points. For San Francisco, hate that we have lost Elijah Mitchell. Now, I'm not going to hold anything against anybody on either side of the football from last week's game for the San Francisco 49ers. That was horrible weather. I'm talking about torrential downpour. And we tried to warn people. We tried to warn people on Friday in the tailgate show. We tried to warn people on Saturday night in the live stream. I definitely warned people Sunday morning when I was showing pictures on stream of puddles on the field in Soldier Field. But now we have no Elijah Mitchell for 2 months with a sprained MCL. Jeff Wilson kind of going to look to take over that lead role. But I also expect to see more Deebo Samuel in the backfield, more Trey Lance in the running game, and going up against Seattle, they allowed over 20 fantasy points per game to running backs just last week. With the injury to Elijah Mitchell, it may be somewhat of a committee here in this backfield. And I hate that because Jeff Wilson Jr. has put up big fantasy days in the past. I'm going to be on the lookout to see if they activate TD Price or Jordan Mason coming up this week. If they do, those are two rookies that I have my eye on that could really take away some of this volume early season in San Francisco. For right now, though, Jeff Wilson in this matchup should have the lion's share of targets and the touchdown opportunities on the goal line. So I got him as a fringe start for me here this week. For Cincinnati and Dallas, Joe Mixon. Obviously going to start Joe Mixon. 145 total yards, 18 fantasy points, and a top 10 finish just last week. Had 35 touches in week 1. Huge weekly volume is what we love to see in our running backs. Going up against the Dallas Cowboys, they allowed 17.8 fantasy points per game to running backs last week. T. Higgins in the concussion protocol. Does he play this week? If he doesn't, we could see that huge volume once again for Joe Mixon, and volume is key. That and scoring opportunities, along with the offensive line, which is just opening up huge holes for this guy. Everything that you need for big days, Joe Mixon for sure a start. For Dallas, another huge risk. I would literally consider sitting Zeke Elliott this week, but I don't know if you can really afford to do that. I'm not panicked just yet, but I'm overly worried, I guess I could say, when it comes to Zeke Elliott. He did average 5.2 yards per carry. Visually, Zeke Elliott looks fine himself. This isn't a Zeke Elliott issue. He couldn't run consistently against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and that's understood. That's a very difficult run defense. But do they fall behind more often now, which means that we see maybe more Tony Pollard than Ezekiel Elliott in, positive game scripts? Now, Zeke only out-touched Pollard 11-8. Now they go up against Cincinnati. They only allowed 10.3 fantasy points to running backs last week, but don't forget that's because Najee Harris did go down with that injury. But prior to that, the defense in Cincinnati didn't look half bad. The offensive line is in shambles. They've lost Connor McGovern now, as well as Tyron Smith. They lost Dak Prescott. This offense is going to be scary. Does Zeke even get the volume? Do they give him opportunities inside the 5 for touchdowns? Our defense is just going to stack the boxes against Cooper Rush and really clog up every single running lane. If that happens, maybe we see more Tony Pollard in the slot. Maybe we see Pollard and Zeke on the field more together. I understand that Tony Pollard isn't the greatest pass blocker. I understand that Zeke's not going to have anywhere to run. This is going to be a nightmare. Zeke Elliott is another one of those guys that I would love to be able to sit this week, but I don't know if you can afford to do it. He is a fringe start. 15 out of 25. I have no warm fuzzies about this guy. I am absolutely terrified going forward until we get Dak Prescott back. It's just one of those things that we're kind of going to have to deal with the cards that we're dealt and hope for the best. Now, Zeke Elliott needs to find the end zone. If he can do that, he'll save your fantasy day. If he doesn't, you're probably going to be disappointed. How about the Denver Broncos and Houston Texans now? Dameon Pierce and Rex Burkhead for Houston. Now, I'm sorry to everyone who out there believed that Dameon Pierce was going to be a Hall of Fame candidate before he even had a regular season game. 39 total yards, 3 yards per carry. Not going to cut it. Now, Rex Burkhead didn't do much better, only averaged 3 yards per carry as well, but he did out-touch Dameon Pierce 19-12. Now a matchup going up against Denver. They just allowed 7.9 fantasy points to running backs last week, an overall solid run D in Denver, no major injury concerns. But the X factor here is the low-scoring offense. It's a split backfield. Both these guys are going to get touches, and no pass work going the way of Dameon Pierce. Limited opportunities for them to be on the goal line for goal line touchdowns. It's just one of those things that we kind of saw in the preseason where if this offense was able to move the ball more consistently and put more points on the board, we like these guys a little bit more. But with the lack of touchdown upside, the limited touches, the negative game scripts, it's hard to start either one of them. They're both going to be sits. For Denver, the exact opposite. It is just like we expected, a split backfield. Once they re-signed Melvin Gordon, this is why we didn't overly, shoot for the moon on Javonte Williams, even though love Javonte Williams. They both had some costly fumbles this past week, which is not ideal, but at least they both had one each, so it's not like one's going to get punished and not the other. Javonte Williams had 108 total yards. Gordon was 72. Now, what was surprising to me is Javonte Williams saw 11 targets in the passing game to Melvin Gordon only having 2. That's a huge surprise because Gordon also outcarried Javonte Williams on the ground 12-7. But now they get a matchup going up against the Houston Texans, who allow over 33 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. No major injury concerns here for the Denver Broncos. A great matchup, big time usage, huge efficiency, and all that pass work. Now, obviously, I feel a little bit better about Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. Melvin's more of a deeper league flex play at best. But that passing work going the way of Javonte Williams is a huge surprise, a huge plus, and definitely going to make him a start as well this week. So now we'll go over to Las Vegas for the Raiders and the Cardinals. And for the Cardinals, you got James Conner, who only had 55 total yards last week, but did find the end zone, 14 fantasy points, and had 15 total touches. It really could have been more, though, had that game been closer. It got out of hand super early, and the Chiefs absolutely annihilated my Arizona Cardinals. Now a matchup going up against Las Vegas, who only allowed 17.3 fantasy points to opposing running backs just last week. No major injury concerns, I guess you can say, as far as affecting James Conner's role. We know that Zach Ertz still limited. We know that we have no DeAndre Hopkins. What is the status of Rondale Moore this coming up week? So a lot of opportunity for James Conner to still get those touches. He tied for second on the team in targets as well with 6. That's definitely going to bring up his floor weekly, and in this matchup, he's going to be a start. Same for Josh Jacobs, 73 total yards, only 7.8 fantasy points just last week, but he played well. 5.7 yards per carry and had 1 reception for 16 yards. He's the clear leader in that backfield, had a super tough matchup last week against the Los Angeles Chargers, and this, on paper, should be a much easier matchup going up against Arizona, who allowed over 40 fantasy points in week 1 to opposing running backs. In fact, I'm probably going to head over to Prize Picks on this one and smash the over on Josh Jacobs this week as well. Currently sitting at a rushing prop of 57.5 rushing yards. I can definitely see him eclipsing that against such a poor run defense in the Arizona Cardinals. For the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers now. For the Bears, you got David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. Now, I'm holding nothing against anyone. I mentioned this when we talked about the San Francisco 49ers. I'm not looking at anything on paper and holding it against any of these guys in any type of negative way, because there's nothing you can really take away from last week's game. It was disgusting. The weather was horrible. David Montgomery did outtouch Khalil Herbert 20-10. Green Bay last week, they allowed almost 16 fantasy points per game to their running backs in Minnesota. Real no major injury concerns here, but we just need to see what happens with these guys when the field isn't flooded. They were out there playing on slip and slides last week, and I'm not holding anything against it. As of right now, David Montgomery still leading this backfield in touches, and hopefully, if they're playing on something other than water, should be able to really produce more and give you a better fantasy day. He's going to be my start here in this backfield. For the Packers, I'm going with both Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. The Green Bay offense overall, though, I mean, Dillon did what he was supposed to do, right? 91 total yards and a touchdown, 17.6 fantasy points. Aaron Jones somewhat struggled. He only had 76 total yards, but 9.8 yards per carry. That is a huge number for Aaron Jones. Now, Dillon outtouched Aaron Jones 15-8, but Matt LaFleur, head coach of the Packers, has already come out and said, listen, we need to get Aaron Jones more touches. You know that's okay with Aaron Rodgers because he's already having trouble with his receivers down the field. Maybe I'm off a little bit here, but I watched a lot of this game, and there was a hit that Aaron Jones took early on in that game. And ever since that hit, he just didn't seem the same. I don't know if his eggs were slightly scrambled or what it was, but after that hit on a short pass early in the game, he just looked kind of out of it a little bit. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into things. There's no injury reports with him talking about any injury, but just something I noticed as I was watching. Chicago allowed over 21 fantasy points last week to running backs. They're going to be heavily relied upon here in Green Bay, both A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones. The passing offense is going to be gross. The big plays and the efficiencies are going to be in the backfield. I expect A.J. Dillon to continue and Aaron Jones to bounce back here this week. How about the Tennessee Titans and Buffalo Bills? Worried about Derrick Henry this week. This week, that defense in Buffalo is no joke. Last week, we saw Derrick Henry get held to 82 rushing yards, 8.2 fantasy points, but the clear leader once again in this backfield. He was just limited by the New York Giants, and we saw a couple big passing plays go the way of Dontrell Hilliard. That is not something we can count on every single week. The volume still there, 21 touches on the ground for Derrick Henry, but going up against Buffalo, who only allowed 11.6 fantasy points to running backs last week, is going to be a tough matchup for him, especially at home in Buffalo. You don't sit Derrick Henry. You just don't do that, ever. He's always in your starting lineup if he's healthy and he's playing, but this Bills defense is legit and they deserve respect. I'm not going to go out on a limb and expect some huge game from Derrick Henry. He's sitting right here, 15 out of 25 points, but still a start with a lot of risk. For Buffalo, another one of those backfields that I just can't get in on, right? I mean, this is what happens when three running backs are really involved. It hurts their overall production of just one guy having a good game. Do we see more James Cook this week? I mean, Moss actually led this backfield in touches in week 1, which is crazy. He had 12 to 10 for Devin Singletary. But the Bills were up big later in the game. Maybe that's why we saw more Zach Moss. Tennessee, they just allowed over 32 fantasy points to running backs last week. No major injuries of concern for Buffalo. But I just can't start any of these guys. There really is no huge ceiling weekly. It's a bunch of guys that are going to eat into each other's ceiling, and it's really going to depend who finds the end zone. If I had to peg one this week, it would be Devin Singletary. Am I confident enough in saying that to start the guy? No. Him, Moss, James Cook, all going to be sits for me. And then last game of the week, the Minnesota Vikings, Philadelphia Eagles. You never sit Dalvin Cook. We did see more Alexander Mattison than I was really expecting, but Cook still had 108 total yards, 12.3 fantasy points in week 1. He had 23 total touches to Alexander Madison's 8 touches. Still big volume, a lot of scoring opportunities in this offense too. We saw Minnesota's offense be a lot more explosive. Now a matchup going up against Philadelphia that was destroyed on the ground by the Detroit Lions, giving up over 40 fantasy points in week 1. Just look at what DeAndre Swift did last week and tell me that Dalvin Cook probably couldn't do the same thing. Now, are we expecting that type of a huge game? Maybe not, but a big day coming for Dalvin Cook, I don't mind it whatsoever. And then Miles Sanders and the Philadelphia Eagles backfield, this is such a nightmare. All three running backs had a touchdown here. Miles Sanders did great, though. He averaged 7.4 yards per carry, had 17.6 fantasy points. Gainwell, he even had 10.2 fantasy points, and then Scott chipped in another 7. 15 touches for Miles Sanders to Gainwell 7. If we can get 15 touches a week from Miles Sanders, we're going to be excited. Now they're going up against the Minnesota Vikings, who allowed over 26 fantasy points last week to running backs, but who gets the touchdowns, right? Do they all get the touchdowns? We know this is going to be a run-heavy offense. As of right now, seeing the volume going the way of Miles Sanders makes him slightly safer, in my opinion, in a matchup in which they could find some running lanes to start Miles Sanders this week. I don't think Gainwell or Boston Scott get enough volume to even be considered here at this point. And there you have it, our starts and sits for the running back position here, week 2 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to provide you with some information that makes your decisions maybe a little bit easier. Don't forget also, we have some rankings coming out end of the week, some injury updates as well, and our live streams this week, and you do not want to miss out on those tons of information in those videos. But for now, I'm going to get out here for the day. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day and a great week, and we'll talk to you later.